Morning.
I know it's maybe a little windy out there today, but I think it's supposed to be a pretty nice day, other than the wind. But that is the Texas Panhandle in the middle of January, so maybe that's kind of what we can expect, is a little wind every once in a while. I do have a couple of cards up here I want to read. But before I do that, let's send a card around for Press Holcomb. That's a relative of the Stones that has cancer, and it sounds like it might be a little bit not good. So let's send a card around, and Shirley, I'm going to get you started. And for Press Holcomb, a young man with cancer.
My son-in-law's nephew.
Son-in-law's nephew, Don's son-in-law's nephew. But I got to tell you, we do have a website that has a prayer list on it, and we also have several people on there that are just anybody that wants someone added. There's a way to do that. Just email it to me, and we'll add it. But there are several people on there, and there are other things on there. One of them being Don's thoughts for just worthwhile reading. And so there are things on there that are worthwhile. But I urge you to explore it. It's just HeadleyChurchOfChrist.com. And we're still working on it. We can make changes. But it is up and running. And I hope it helps people in some way. I have a couple of cards. Thank you so much for your generous donation. You help many students in our community have a Merry Christmas. God bless. This is the Headley High School National Honor Society. And it's signed by Perla Carrion, Esteban Carrion, Colin Monroe, Kara Lambert, Jordan Upton, Emma Lambert, and Katie McCleskey. We also have a thank you card here from the Rose Cemetery. Thank you so much for the memorial to Rose Cemetery, the family of Geraldine Holland. And so there's a couple of thank yous that we want to remember. We also want to keep in mind those that have suffered from the effects of the storms that we've had. They've been all over, the wildfires in Australia, or the flooding down in Texas, or the tornadoes that we've had. There's been a lot of people have been put in bad situations due to the weather. Let's keep them in mind as we go forward. Let's continue to remember those that have been suffered from violence in churches. Let's remember them. Sometimes you go visit a big church and they'll have a whole list of ministers. And sometimes it'll be, this is the service minister. And that'll be the guy that kind of plans the service process. What songs you're going to lead that'll meet up with the sermon, and what kind of classes you're going to have that'll all coordinate together to make the service all work together. And that's a good idea. Now, we don't have a service minister here, and that's okay. I'm not suggesting we need one. But sometimes, I'll preach a sermon, or I'm about to get up and say something, and I'll think, it's almost like Blackie and I planned that the songs that he led are going to fit with my sermon. Either they are after we've spoke or before. And we don't get together. But it's sometimes like that they almost fit together. Which reminded me of a story. This is just a story. It's a preacher story. There's a preacher one time, he is up and he is preaching, and he is adamant that we need to get rid of vice. This is what he is. It's a rant against vice, which is all right. Bad habits and vice are good topics. And he was saying, I wish we could just take all the alcohol in the world and just take it down there and throw it in the river and get rid of it. Take all the cigarettes and throw them in the river and get rid of it. And I wish we could take all the illegal drugs and just take it to the river and just throw it in there and get rid of it. And he went through a whole list of bad habits and vices. Just go throw it in the river. And he's urging his people to get rid of these bad habits. And after his sermon, he gets down, and the song leader gets up, and the first song he leads is, "Shall we gather at the river?" That's just a joke. Blackie wouldn't do that to me. I don't know he would. But that is just a story. Sometimes in ancient times, they had what they call a symposium. And many of your ancient philosophers, Plato and Aristotle, Socrates, they would have the symposium, which would be where you would have a meal. And there would be teaching at the meal. There would be the time the philosopher, he would teach his students over this meal, and they would have discussions. And many times they would be recorded. Cicero was a Roman philosopher, at the same time as Julius Caesar. And he had a slave named Tiro. And Tiro was the first person to develop a shorthand. And that was his job, was to record all these conversations, record all these symposiums and letters, and then publish them. It was very much a way that people were educated. And in the ancient times, a lot of times, when you would have a dinner party, you would have 3 tables, one across here and then 2 down the sides. Usually there would be 3 people on each, be a person, 9 people. It didn't have to be, it could be any size, but that was typical. Kind of like we have here. We have seats on both sides and in the middle, and then between them they would have the entertainment, whether it was someone to come in and play an instrument or recite poetry or whatever it might be. But sometimes they would have this symposium, and they would have a dinner, and they would invite an expert, whether it was in farming practices or poetry or politics, and they would have this discussion. They would know, it was planned. We're going to have a discussion over politics. And they would have, on one side they would have one particular person, and on the other side they would have another, and they would have a discussion. And this is what they would do. They have dinner, and then they would have this discussion. And sometimes people would record it, and it would be published. And one of the things about it is that was one of the ways they kind of educated each other. And we have that today. It's many times called the Table of Wisdom and Knowledge down at the Rock Inn, or maybe down here at Senior Citizens when we have coffee.
Or the Liars Club.
Or the Liars Club. But we have the same thing. We have a meal or a cup of coffee, and we have a discussion. We may not think it's always worth recording, but it's a good time to have a discussion. And we see with Jesus, he did this many times. You see him having meals and teaching. Whether that's feeding the 5,000 and then having a sermon, whether that's having with Mary and Martha and having a very intimate time, or we saw last week where he was with the Levi, the call of Levi, they had the time there. But he uses the time of meal to teach over and over. And that's a very effective way. And that was kind of a controversy that they had at that time. We saw last week, and it's the same thing, is that we see in John 37 that John the Baptist has come eating no bread and drinking no wine, and you say he has a demon. The Son of Man has come eating and drinking, and you say, look at him, a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. So sometimes Jesus would get in trouble with that. But Jesus would teach meals at all times. But this is kind of the scribes and the Pharisees' reaction to Jesus. They think that he is a glutton and a drunkard. But the people sometimes have a little bit of a different feeling. Right before that it says, when Jesus raised the young man from the dead, that they says, fear seized them all, and they glorified God, saying, a great prophet has arisen among us, and God has visited his people. That the people think that a great prophet has come, and they are rejoicing at that. And we're going to look at today, we're going to look at another meal in Luke. Jesus uses, in Luke there are many times where it's recorded that Jesus uses a meal to educate and to teach. And we're going to look at another one today. We looked at with Levi last week, and we're going to look this week at 7, Luke chapter 7, beginning in 36. This is the story of Simon the Pharisee and the sinful woman. One of the Pharisees asked him to eat with him, and he went into the Pharisee's house and reclined at table. And behold, a woman of the city, who was a sinner, when she learned that he was reclining at table in the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster flask of ointment, and standing behind him at his feet weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears, and wiped them with the hair of her head, and kissed his feet, and anointed them with ointment. Now when the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would have known who and what sort of woman this is who is touching him, for she is a sinner. And Jesus answering said to him, Simon, I have something to say to you. And he answered, say it, teacher. A certain moneylender had two debtors. One owed 500 denarii, the other 50. When they could not pay, he canceled the debt of both. Now which of them will love him more? Simon answered. The one, I suppose, for whom he canceled the larger debt. And he said to him, You have judged rightly. Then turning toward the woman, he said to Simon, Do you see this woman? I entered your house. You gave me no water for my feet, but she has wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You gave me no kiss, but from the time I came in, she has not ceased to kiss my feet. You did not anoint my head with oil, but she has anointed my feet with ointment. Therefore I tell you, her sins, which are many, are forgiven, for she loved much. But he who is forgiven little, loves little. And he said to her, Your sins are forgiven. Then those who were at the table with him began to say among themselves, Who is this, who even forgives sins? And he said to the woman, Your faith has saved you. Go in peace. Now this is another one of those symposium type situations that Simon the Pharisee has invited Jesus to his house for supper. Now I think that the questions we have is why? Why would Simon invite Jesus for supper? That the Pharisees don't particularly like Jesus. They have that idea that he's a drunkard and he eats with sinners all the time and tax collectors. So why would he do that? The Bible doesn't tell us. That's one of the things that God has not revealed to us through his word. But doesn't mean that I don't think we should think about it. Because I think when we think about why Simon did this, it helps us to think about what we can learn from this story and learn from this passage. It is possible that Simon was simply being a good Jew. Hospitality was important to the Jews. And when you had a traveling rabbi, that it would be, you're supposed to feed him. When he comes in, he's a teacher, and he's traveling, it's a good Jew's idea to feed him. And that may be it. It may just be a sense of duty. You know, Kay sometimes chastises me over that I look at a lot of things through duty, and I do. But I think that sometimes that can be a good thing, and it also can be a weakness. Because sometimes I got to tell you that I do things out of duty. Sometimes when we were just going to church, is that we would it's just what you do. It's Sunday morning, it's time to go. And you go. Just because it is what you do. But once you get there, I am convinced that always there is a benefit that once you get, even if you just go because you're supposed to, even if you just go out of a sense of duty, there is still a benefit. Once you get there, the songs that you sing, the fellowships you have, to listen to the prayers and the lesson, they all go together to benefit you. And so there have been many times in my life where I probably didn't feel like going to church. But when I did go, I was always glad that I did. And so sometimes I think that Simon may have only been proceeding out of duty. And it was his duty to feed a traveling rabbi, a traveling Jew, and he did. On the other hand, I like to think that Simon is curious, that he's heard all this stuff. He has seen what Jesus has done. He's heard the reports of him, and he is curious and wants to see for himself about Jesus. We saw there that the people think he is a prophet. And I think that Simon, I like to think that he is curious and seeking it out. And we're having this type of symposium, and when they do, it's a low table. And the people, they don't sit at the table. They lie there at the table with their head facing the table and their feet struck out. Because a lot of times you might not want your feet right in your neighbor's face. So it's a good idea to keep them stretched out behind you. But they have it set up. And this woman shows up. It doesn't necessarily mean that she's a gatecrasher. She may be. We don't know. But many times when you would have one of these symposiums, it would be open to the public. There would be the people at the table having the discussion. But if you were just a member of the public and were curious, you could come in and you could sit at the back of the room. Many times it would be in a courtyard outside. And you could sit at the back and listen. Nothing wrong with that. They encourage that. And if the host of the party was a particularly wealthy man, you would probably be given some food at the end of the party. Whatever was left would be distributed to the people who were listening and the slaves and that kind of thing. So it was a way to encourage people to come. So she may not have been a gatecrasher. It may have been open to the public. not for the meal itself, but for the discussion. But when she gets there, she certainly does create a scene. She's weeping. She's got her hair down, which would be scandalous at this time. For a woman to have her hair down in public would be a very scandalous behavior. Now, that was a very intimate type thing to have your hair down, for a woman to have her hair down. She's touching Jesus. She is anointing his feet. She's kissing his feet. This is a very dramatic appearance by this woman. And Simon has a thought. When we look at Simon, now when the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would have known who and what sort of woman this is who is touching him, for she is a sinner. One of the things we see in Luke, what you see is always important. You know, last week it said that Jesus saw Levi sitting there, and he reacted. And here we have this Pharisee that he looks at this woman and he saw a Caesar. But what does he see? Does he see the woman, or does he see the histrionics? That I've got this woman who is of the worst reputation in the entire community, and she's come to my house, and she's crying, and she's pouring oil, and she's kissing my guest. And I can imagine that this is not his favorite time. This was not how he imagined this meal would go. But he also has a thought to himself about Jesus. Not only about her, but also about Jesus. If this man were a prophet, he would know who it was. So he is not only judging the woman, but he is judging Jesus. Now as we think about this for just a minute, I know it's easy to look at this Pharisee and say, he's a bad guy. But just think a minute. Is there anybody that you would not want kissing your feet? That you wouldn't want touching you? And I know, I'm going to tell you there are. And I know that's not a good attitude, but there are. And that's something I need to get over. But there are people out there that I don't want touching me. And particularly there are people out there I don't want touching my spouse or my family. And that is something that we need to realize before we judge this Pharisee too harshly. We need to look at our own hearts and see what we have. Because as we see, even though this man says this to himself, Jesus answers. But the Lord said to Samuel, no, I'm sorry. The Lord answers, and he looks upon his heart. Even though Simon is talking to himself, the Lord looks at our heart. This is going back to 1 Samuel 16, where David is first anointed, and Samuel is confused over the appearance as opposed to the heart. And the Lord speaks to Samuel and says, do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. And when we're considering someone that may be of a bad reputation, and they may have earned it, I'm not saying that they may have done things that are not right. Let's remember that the Lord looks at their heart. We may not have that ability, but before we judge them, let's be aware that we don't really know their hearts. And so let's not be so concerned about them and judging them, but be willing to let the Lord look on their heart. And because Jesus does, and he does make an answer. I'm off of them. Turning toward the woman, he said to Simon, do you see this woman? Again, we see that. Do you see? I entered your house. You gave me no water for my feet, but she has wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. Do you see this woman? Because Jesus wants us to look at this woman not just as a woman with a bad reputation who may be creating a scene at a dinner party. He wants us to see who she is. That she is a woman created in God's image. That she is a woman who is a child of God and is deserving of respect, and that we respect her and that we appreciate her, not just for what the scene that she's causing, but for who she is. And Jesus sees it. And he says to Simon, do you see this woman? Now we asked earlier, Is Simon a good guy or a bad guy? We were kind of talking about his motivation. When we see this phrase, that I entered your house and you didn't do this for me, you didn't give me water for my feet, or a slave to wash my feet, you didn't give me the kiss, you didn't give me the oil, you didn't show me the respect that you should have. That certainly looks like that Simon may not have invited Jesus for the right reasons. Even though he invited him to the house, that's not what he was expecting. It just isn't. And he doesn't treat him very well. But on the other hand, this is the first time that Jesus uses this man's name, Simon. Up until this point, it's just been the Pharisee. But now Jesus says, Simon, do you see? And at this point, he's personalizing this with the Pharisee, Simon. And I think this indicates that he wants to teach this person also. He's not just throwing him away, he's not rejecting him. He's wanting to teach him. Which makes me think that maybe Simon had a little better heart than sometimes we give him credit for. That maybe Simon is worth teaching also. But I love the question, do you see this woman? You know, when this woman walked in, she's crying and wailing and anointing his feet, and kissing his feet, and has her hair down. Everybody at this party saw this woman. I mean, everybody did. This woman can't sneak in. But Jesus says, do you see her? And I think that's something he wants us to do, is do you see her? And I think sometimes when we see somebody that's in need of help, and I think this woman was, she was in need of community. She was in need of acceptance. She was in need of this whole Jewish community. And she had needs. And sometimes we look at people. I see that person, they're hungry. We see somebody on the road with a sign up saying, please give me something, I'm hungry. We see them as somebody that's needy. But Jesus looks at this woman and he says to Simon, do you see this woman? And she has something to teach you. She has something that if you will look at her and if you will see her, you can learn from her, not just the other way around. And I think that's an important point to remember, that this woman had something to teach. And when we're looking at our community, let's be sure that we look at our community as this is someone I can learn from, no matter who they are. And I got to tell you, a lot of evil people come in front of me. They do. And it's sometimes very hard to look at them as this is a human, is created in God's image and deserving of respect. But they are. And not only that, but it is important to look at everyone as this person has something to teach me. Just as God, Jesus, used this woman to teach Simon, he's put people in our lives to teach us. Not just the good people. You know, many times I mention that I think of Don as a mentor, and I do. And he's the kind of guy that we're proud to call mentors. But there are also people that sometimes come into our lives that may not be such good people, but we can still learn from them. We've asked a lot of questions about this passage. You know, why did Simon invite Jesus? Where did this woman meet? It doesn't tell us where this woman met Jesus. She obviously knows him when she comes in. And it doesn't tell us whether she's just heard about him, whether she's had an encounter with him. There's just these gaps that are left out that I think we need to think about to help us think about this passage. But there is one other question that the people who are watching that say, and they say, who is this? Who is this? And that is the question that we have to answer. Who is this? Who is this Jesus that uses women of bad reputation to teach religious leaders? Who is this that forgives sins? Who is this that heals people? And that's the question that we have to answer too. Who is Jesus? And when he comes to us, and as he's coming today, what will be our reaction? What will be our reaction when the question comes up is, who is this? And as we complete our lesson, that's the question I want you to ask. Who is Jesus to me? What does he mean to me? And what can we do from there? Because he is always teaching us, whether it's through his word, or through our people, or through the world around us. If we're open to him, he is teaching us. So who is this Jesus? If you need any help in answering that question in any way, we want to help you. If you would come forward as we stand and as we sing.